Chapter 13 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 13. An oaken, broken elbow-chair, a caudle cup without an ear, a battered, shattered ash bedstead, a box of deal without a lid, a pair of tongs, but out of joint, a back-sword poker, without point, a dish which might good meat afford once, an Ovid, and an old concordance. Thomas Sheridan, a true and faithful inventory of the goods belonging to Dr. Swift. 11. Lines 1 through 6, and 13 through 14. No sooner did Deerslayer raise the pistols than he turned to the Delaware, and held them up for his admiration. "Child gun," said the Serpent, smiling, while he handled one of the instruments as if it had been a toy. "Not it, Sarpent, not it. 'Twas made for a man, and would satisfy a giant, if rightly used. But stop. White men are remarkable for their carelessness in putting away firearms, in chists and corners. Let me look if care has been given to these." As Deerslayer spoke, he took the weapon from the hand of his friend, and opened the pan. The last was filled with priming, caked like a bit of cinder, by time, moisture, and compression. An application of the ramrod showed that both the pistols were charged, although Judith could testify that they had probably lain for years in the chest. It is not easy to portray the surprise of the Indian at this discovery, for he was in the practice of renewing his priming daily, and of looking to the contents of his piece at other short intervals. "This is white neglect," said Deerslayer, shaking his head, "and scarce a season goes by that some one in the settlements doesn't suffer from it. It's extraordinary, too, Judith, yes, it's downright extraordinary, that the owner shall fire his piece at a deer, or some other game, or perhaps at an inimy, and twice out of 3 times he'll miss. But let him catch an accident with one of these forgotten charges, and he makes it sartain death to a child, or a brother, or a friend. Well, we shall do a good turn to the owner, if we fire these pistols for him; and as they're novelties to you and me, Sarpent, we'll try our hands at a mark. Freshen that priming, and I'll do the same with this, and then we'll see who is the best man with a pistol. As for the rifle, that's long been settled atween us." Deerslayer laughed heartily at his own conceit, and in a minute or two they were both standing on the platform, selecting some object in the ark for their target. Judith was led by curiosity to their side. "Stand back, gal, stand a little back. These weapons have been long loaded," said Deerslayer, "and some accident may happen in the discharge." "Then you shall not fire them. Give them both to the Delaware, or it would be better to unload them without firing." "That's ag'in usage, and some people say ag'in manhood, though I hold to no such silly doctrine. We must fire 'em, Judith; yes, we must fire 'em, though I foresee that neither will have any great reason to boast of his skill." Judith, in the main, was a girl of great personal spirit, and her habits prevented her from feeling any of the terror that is apt to come over her sex at the report of firearms. She had discharged many a rifle, and had even been known to kill a deer under circumstances that were favorable to the effort. She submitted, therefore, falling a little back by the side of Deerslayer, giving the Indian the front of the platform to himself. Chingachgook raised the weapon several times, endeavored to steady it by using both hands, changed his attitude from one that was awkward to another still more so, and finally drew the trigger, with a sort of desperate indifference, without having, in reality, secured any aim at all. The consequence was, that instead of hitting the knot which had been selected for the mark, he missed the ark altogether, the bullet skipping along the water like a stone that was thrown by hand. "Well done, Sarpent, well done!" cried Deerslayer, laughing, with his noiseless glee. "You've hit the lake, and that's an exploit for some men. I know'd it, and as much as said it, here, to Judith, for your short we'pons don't belong to red skin gifts. You've hit the lake, and that's better than only hitting the air. Now stand back, and let us see what white gifts can do with a white weapon. A pistol isn't a rifle, but color is color." The aim of Deerslayer was both quick and steady, and the report followed almost as soon as the weapon rose. Still the pistol hung fire, as it is termed, and fragments of it flew in a dozen directions, some falling on the roof of the castle, others in the ark, and one in the water. Judith screamed, and when the two men turned anxiously towards the girl, she was as pale as death, trembling in every limb. "She's wounded; yes, the poor gal's wounded, Sarpent, though one couldn't foresee it, standing where she did. We'll lead her in to a seat, and we must do the best for her that our knowledge and skill can afford." Judith allowed herself to be supported to a seat, swallowed a mouthful of the water that the Delaware offered her in a gourd, and, after a violent fit of trembling that seemed ready to shake her fine frame to dissolution, she burst into tears. "The pain must be borne, poor Judith; yes, it must be borne," said Deerslayer soothingly, "though I am far from wishing you not to weep, for weeping often lightens galish feelin's. Where can she be hurt, Sarpent? I see no signs of blood, nor any rent of skin or garments." "I am uninjured, Deerslayer," stammered the girl through her tears. "It's fright, nothing more, I do assure you, and, God be praised, no one, I find, has been harmed by the accident." "This is extraordinary!" exclaimed the unsuspecting and simple-minded hunter. "I thought, Judith, you'd been above settlement weaknesses, and that you was a gal not to be frightened by the sound of a bursting weapon. No, I didn't think you so skeary. Hetty might well have been startled, but you've too much judgment and reason to be frightened when the danger's all over. They're pleasant to the eye, chief, and changeful, but very unsartain in their feelin's." Shame kept Judith silent. There had been no acting in her agitation, but all had fairly proceeded from sudden and uncontrollable alarm, an alarm that she found almost as inexplicable to herself as it proved to be to her companions. Wiping away the traces of tears, however, she smiled again, and was soon able to join in the laugh at her own folly. "And you, Deerslayer," she at length succeeded in saying, "are you, indeed, altogether unhurt? It seems almost miraculous that a pistol should have burst in your hand, and you escape without the loss of a limb, if not of life." "Such wonders aren't uncommon at all, among worn-out arms. The first rifle they gave me played the same trick, and yet I lived through it, though not as unharmless as I've got out of this affair. Thomas Hutter is master of one pistol less than he was this morning, but as it happened in trying to sarve him, there's no ground of complaint. Now, draw near, and let us look farther into the inside of the chist." Judith by this time had so far gotten the better of her agitation as to resume her seat, and the examination went on. The next article that offered was enveloped in cloth, and on opening it, it proved to be one of the mathematical instruments that were then in use among seamen, possessing the usual ornaments and fastenings in brass. Deerslayer and Chingachgook expressed their admiration and surprise at the appearance of the unknown instrument, which was bright and glistening, having apparently been well cared for. "This goes beyond the surveyors, Judith," Deerslayer exclaimed, after turning the instrument several times in his hands. "I've seen all their tools often, and wicked and heartless enough are they, for they never come into the forest but to lead the way to waste and destruction. But none of them have as designing a look as this. I fear me, after all, that Thomas Hutter has journeyed into the wilderness with no fair intentions towards its happiness. Did you ever see any of the cravings of a surveyor about your father, gal?" "He is no surveyor, Deerslayer, nor does he know the use of that instrument, though he seems to own it. Do you suppose that Thomas Hutter ever wore that coat? It is as much too large for him, as this instrument is beyond his learning." "That's it. That must be it, Sarpent, and the old fellow, by some unknown means, has fallen heir to another man's goods. They say he has been a mariner, and no doubt this chist, and all it holds, ha! What have we here? This far outdoes the brass and black wood of the tool." Deerslayer had opened a small bag, from which he was taking, one by one, the pieces of a set of chessmen. They were of ivory, much larger than common, and exquisitely wrought. Each piece represented the character or thing after which it is named. the knights being mounted, the castle stood on elephants, and even the pawns possessed the heads and busts of men. The set was not complete, and a few fractures betrayed bad usage, but all that was left had been carefully put away and preserved. Even Judith expressed wonder, as these novel objects were placed before her eyes, and Chingachgook fairly forgot his Indian dignity in admiration and delight. The latter took up each piece, and examined it with never tiring satisfaction, pointing out to the girl the more ingenious and striking portions of the workmanship. But the elephants gave him the greatest pleasure. The huss that he uttered, as he passed his fingers over their trunks, and ears, and tails, were very distinct. Nor did he fail to note the pawns, which were armed as archers. This exhibition lasted several minutes, during which time Judith and the Indian had all the rapture to themselves. Deerslayer sat silent, thoughtful, and even gloomy, though his eyes followed each movement of the two principal actors, noting every new peculiarity about the pieces as they were held up to view. Not an exclamation of pleasure, nor a word of condemnation passed his lips. At length his companions observed his silence, and then, for the first time since the chessmen had been discovered, did he speak. "Judith," he asked earnestly, but with a concern that amounted almost to tenderness of manner, "did your parents ever talk to you of religion?" The girl colored, and the flashes of crimson that passed over her beautiful countenance were like the wayward tints of a Neapolitan sky in November. Deerslayer had given her so strong a taste for truth, however, that she did not waver in her answer, replying simply and with sincerity. "My mother did often," she said. "My father never. I thought it made my mother sorrowful to speak of our prayers and duties. But my father has never opened his mouth on such matters, before or since her death." "That I can believe, that I can believe. He has no God; no such God as it becomes a man of white skin to worship, or even a red skin. Them things are idols." Judith started, and for a moment she seemed seriously hurt. Then she reflected, and in the end she laughed. "And you think, Deerslayer, that these ivory toys are my father's gods? I have heard of idols, and know what they are." "Them are idols," repeated the other positively. "Why should your father keep 'em, if he doesn't worship 'em?" "Would he keep his gods in a bag, and locked up in a chest? No, no, Deerslayer, my poor father carries his God with him, wherever he goes, and that is in his own cravings. These things may really be idols, I think they are myself, from what I have heard and read of idolatry, but they have come from some distant country, and like all the other articles, have fallen into Thomas Hutter's hands when he was a sailor." "I'm glad of it. I am downright glad to hear it, Judith, for I do not think I could have mustered the resolution to strive to help a white idolater out of his difficulties. The old man is of my color and nation, and I wish to sarve him; but as one who denied all his gifts, in the way of religion, it would have come hard to do so. That animal seems to give you great satisfaction, Sarpent, though it's an idolatrous beast at the best." "It is an elephant," interrupted Judith. "I've often seen pictures of such animals at the garrisons, and mother had a book in which there was a printed account of the creature. Father burnt that with all the other books, for he said mother loved reading too well. This was not long before mother died, and I've sometimes thought that the loss hastened her end." This was said equally without levity and without any very deep feeling. It was said without levity, for Judith was saddened by her recollections, and yet she had been too much accustomed to live for self, and for the indulgence of her own vanities, to feel her mother's wrongs very keenly. It required extraordinary circumstances to awaken a proper sense of her situation, and to stimulate the better feelings of this beautiful but misguided girl, and those circumstances had not yet occurred in her brief existence. "Elephant or no elephant, 'tis an idol," returned the hunter, "and not fit to remain in Christian keeping." "Good for Iroquois," said Chingachgook, parting with one of the castles with reluctance, as his friend took it from him to replace it in the bag. "Elephant by whole tribe, by Delaware, almost." "Ay, that it would, as any one who comprehends red skin nature must know," answered Deerslayer. But the man that passes false money, Sarpent, is as bad as he who makes it. Did you ever know a just Injin that wouldn't scorn to sell a coon skin for the true marten, or to pass off a mink for a beaver? I know that a few of these idols, perhaps one of them elephants, would go far towards buying Thomas Hutter's liberty, but it goes ag'in conscience to pass such counterfeit money. Perhaps no Injin tribe, hereaway, is downright idolaters, but there's some that come so near it, that white gifts ought to be particular about encouraging them in their mistake." "If idolatry is a gift, Deerslayer, and gifts are what you seem to think them, idolatry in such people can hardly be a sin," said Judith, with more smartness than discrimination. "God grants no such gifts to any of his creatures, Judith," returned the hunter, seriously. "He must be adored, under some name or other, and not creatures of brass or ivory. It matters not whether the Father of all is called God, or Manitou, Deity, or Great Spirit. He is none the less our common Maker and Master, nor does it count for much whether the souls of the just go to paradise or happy hunting grounds, since he may send each his own way, as suits his own pleasure and wisdom. But it curdles my blood, when I find human mortals so bound up in darkness and conceit, as to fashion the 'arth, or wood, or bones, things made by their own hands, into motionless, senseless effigies, and then fall down afore them, and worship them as a deity. After all, Deerslayer, these pieces of ivory may not be idols at all. I remember now to have seen one of the officers at the garrison with a set of fox and geese made in some such a design as these. And here is something hard, wrapped in cloth, that may belong to your idols." Deerslayer took the bundle the girl gave him, and unrolling it, he found the board within. Like the pieces it was large, rich, and inlaid with ebony and ivory. Putting the whole in conjunction, the hunter, though not without many misgivings, slowly came over to Judith's opinion, and finally admitted that the fancied idols must be merely the curiously carved men of some unknown game. Judith had the tact to use her victory with great moderation, nor did she once, even in the most indirect manner, allude to the ludicrous mistake of her companion. This discovery of the uses of the extraordinary looking little images settled the affair of the proposed ransom. It was agreed generally, and all understood the weaknesses and tastes of Indians, that nothing could be more likely to tempt the cupidity of the Iroquois than the elephants, in particular. Luckily, the whole of the castles were among the pieces, and these 4 tower-bearing animals it was finally determined should be the ransom offered. The remainder of the men, and indeed all the rest of the articles in the chest, were to be kept out of view, and to be resorted to only as a last appeal. As soon as these preliminaries were settled, everything but those intended for the bribe was carefully replaced in the chest. All the covers were tucked in as they had been found, and it was quite possible, could Hutter have been put in possession of the castle again, that he might have passed the remainder of his days in it, without even suspecting the invasion that had been made on the privacy of the chest. The rent pistol would have been the most likely to reveal the secret, but this was placed by the side of its fellow, and all were pressed down as before, some half a dozen packages in the bottom of the chest not having been opened at all. When this was done, the lid was lowered, the padlocks replaced, and the key turned. The latter was then replaced in the pocket from which it had been taken. More than an hour was consumed in settling the course proper to be pursued, and in returning everything to its place. The pauses to converse were frequent, and Judith, who experienced a lively pleasure in the open, undisguised admiration with which Deerslayer's honest eyes gazed at her handsome face, found the means to prolong the interview, with a dexterity that seems to be innate in female coquetry. Deerslayer, indeed, appeared to be the first who was conscious of the time that had been thus wasted, and to call the attention of his companion to the necessity of doing something towards putting the plan of ransoming into execution. Chingachgook had remained in Hutter's bedroom, where the elephants were laid, to feast his eyes with the images of animals so wonderful and so novel. Perhaps an instinct told him that his presence would not be as acceptable to his companions as this holding himself aloof, for Judith had not much reserve in the manifestations of her preferences, and the Delaware had not got so far as one betrothed without acquiring some knowledge of the symptoms of the master passion. "Well, Judith," said Deerslayer, rising after the interview had lasted much longer than even he himself suspected, "'tis pleasant convarsing with you, and settling all these matters, but duty calls us another way. All this time, Hurry and your father, not to say Hetty," the word was cut short in the speaker's mouth, for at that critical moment a light step was heard on the platform, or courtyard, a human figure darkened the doorway, and the person last mentioned stood before him. The low exclamation that escaped Deerslayer and the slight scream of Judith were hardly uttered, when an Indian youth, between the ages of 15 and 17, stood beside her. These two entrances had been made with moccasined feet, and consequently almost without noise, but unexpected and stealthy as they were, they had not the effect to disturb Deerslayer's self-possession. His first measure was to speak rapidly in Delaware to his friend, cautioning him to keep out of sight, while he stood on his guard. The second was to step to the door to ascertain the extent of the danger. No one else, however, had come, and a simple contrivance, in the shape of a raft, that lay floating at the side of the ark, at once explained the means that had been used in bringing Hetty off. Two dead and dry, and consequently buoyant, logs of pine were bound together with pins and withes, and a little platform of riven chestnut had been rudely placed on their surfaces. Here Hetty had been seated, on a billet of wood, while the young Iroquois had rowed the primitive and slow-moving, but perfectly safe craft from the shore. As soon as Deerslayer had taken a close survey of this raft, and satisfied himself nothing else was near, he shook his head and muttered in his soliloquizing way, "This comes of prying into another man's chist. Had we been watchful and keen-eyed, such a surprise could never have happened, and getting this much from a boy teaches us what we may expect when the old warriors set themselves fairly about their circumventions. It opens the way, howsever, to a treaty for the ransom, and I will hear what Hetty has to say." Judith, as soon as her surprise and alarm had a little abated, discovered a proper share of affectionate joy at the return of her sister. She folded her to her bosom, and kissed her, as had been her wont in the days of their childhood and innocence. Hetty herself was less affected, for to her there was no surprise, and her nerves were sustained by the purity and holiness of her purpose. At her sister's request, she took a seat, and entered into an account of her adventures since they had parted. Her tale commenced just as Deerslayer returned, and he also became an attentive listener, while the young Iroquois stood near the door, seemingly as indifferent to what was passing as one of its posts. The narrative of the girl was sufficiently clear, until she reached the time where we left her in the camp, after the interview with the chiefs, and at the moment when Hist quitted her, in the abrupt manner already related. The sequel of the story may be told in her own language. "When I read the texts to the chiefs, Judith, you could not have seen that they made any changes on their minds," she said. "But if seed is planted, it will grow. God planted the seeds of all these trees." "Ay, that he did, muttered Deerslayer, "and a goodly harvest has followed." "God planted the seeds of all these trees," continued Hetty, after a moment's pause, "and you see to what a height and shade they have grown. So it is with the Bible. You may read a verse this year and forget it, and it will come back to you a year hence, when you least expect to remember it." "And did you find any thing of this among the savages, poor Hetty?" "Yes, Judith, and sooner and more fully than I had even hoped. I did not stay long with father and Hurry, but went to get my breakfast with Hist. As soon as we had done the chiefs came to us, and then we found the fruits of the seed that had been planted. They said what I had read from the good book was right. It must be right. It sounded right, like a sweet bird singing in their ears. And they told me to come back and say as much to the great warrior who had slain one of their braves, and to tell it to you, and to say how happy they should be to come to church here, in the castle, or to come out in the sun, and hear me read more of the sacred volume, and to tell you that they wish you would lend them some canoes, that they can bring father and Hurry and their women to the castle, that we might all sit on the platform there, and listen to the singing of the pale-face Manitou. There, Judith, did you ever know of anything that so plainly shows the power of the Bible as that?" "If it were true, 'twould be a miracle indeed, Hetty. But all this is no more than Indian cunning and Indian treachery, striving to get the better of us by management, when they find it is not to be done by force. Do you doubt the Bible, sister, that you judge the savages so harshly?" "I do not doubt the Bible, poor Hetty, but I much doubt an Indian and an Iroquois. What do you say to this visit, Deerslayer?" "First let me talk a little with Hetty," returned the party appealed to. "Was the raft made a'ter you had got your breakfast, gal, and did you walk from the camp to the shore opposite to us, here?" "Oh, no, Deerslayer, the raft was ready made and in the water. Could that have been by a miracle, Judith?" "Yes, yes, an Indian miracle," rejoined the hunter. "They're expart enough in them sort of miracles, and you found the raft ready made to your hands, and in the water, and in waiting like for its cargo?" "It was all as you say. The raft was near the camp, and the Indians put me on it, and had ropes of bark, and they dragged me to the place opposite to the castle, and then they told that young man to row me off, here. And the woods are full of the vagabonds waiting to know what is to be the upshot of the miracle. We comprehend this affair, now, Judith, but I'll first get rid of this young Canada bloodsucker, and then we'll settle our own course. Do you and Hetty leave us together, first bringing me the elephants, which the Sarpent is admiring, for 'twill never do to let this loping deer be alone a minute, or he'll borrow a canoe without asking." Judith did as desired, first bringing the pieces, and retiring with her sister into their own room. Deerslayer had acquired some knowledge of most of the Indian dialects of that region, and he knew enough of the Iroquois to hold a dialogue in the language. Beckoning to the lad, therefore, he caused him to take a seat on the chest, when he placed two of the castles suddenly before him. Up to that moment this youthful savage had not expressed a single intelligible emotion, or fancy. There were many things in and about the place that were novelties to him, but he had maintained his self-command with philosophical composure. It is true, Deerslayer had detected his dark eye scanning the defences and the arms, but the scrutiny had been made with such an air of innocence, in such a gaping, indolent, boyish manner, that no one but a man who had himself been taught in a similar school would have even suspected his object. The instant, however, the eyes of the savage fell upon the wrought ivory, and the images of the wonderful unknown beasts, surprise and admiration got the mastery of him. The manner in which the natives of the South Sea Islands first beheld the toys of civilized life has been often described, but the reader is not to confound it with the manner of an American Indian, under similar circumstances. In this particular case, the young Iroquois or Huron permitted an exclamation of rapture to escape him, and then he checked himself like one who had been guilty of an indecorum. After this his eyes ceased to wander, but became riveted on the elephants, one of which, after a short hesitation, he even presumed to handle. Deerslayer did not interrupt him for quite 10 minutes, knowing that the lad was taking such note of the curiosities as would enable him to give the most minute and accurate description of their appearance to his seniors on his return. When he thought sufficient time had been allowed to produce the desired effect, the hunter laid a finger on the naked knee of the youth, and drew his attention to himself. "Listen," he said, "I want to talk with my young friend from the Canadas. Let him forget that wonder for a minute." "Where t'other pale brother?" demanded the boy, looking up, and letting the idea that had been most prominent in his mind previously to the introduction of the chessmen escape him involuntarily. "He sleeps, or if he isn't fairly asleep, he is in the room where the men do sleep," returned Deerslayer. "How did my young friend know there was another?" "See him from the shore. Iroquois have got long eyes. See beyond the clouds. See the bottom of the great spring." "Well, the Iroquois are welcome. 2 pale faces are prisoners in the camp of your fathers, boy." The lad nodded, treating the circumstance with great apparent indifference, though a moment after he laughed, as if exulting in the superior address of his own tribe. Can you tell me, boy, what your chiefs intend to do with these captives, or haven't they yet made up their minds?" The lad looked a moment at the hunter with a little surprise. Then he coolly put the end of his forefinger on his own head, just above the left ear, and passed it round his crown with an accuracy and readiness that showed how well he had been drilled in the peculiar art of his race. "When?" demanded Deerslayer, whose gorge rose at this cool demonstration of indifference to human life. "And why not take them to your wigwams?" "Road too long, and full of pale faces. Wigwam full, and scalps sell high. Small scalp, much gold." "Well, that explains it. Yes, that does explain it. There's no need of being any plainer. Now you know, lad, that the oldest of your prisoners is the father of these two young women, and the other is the suitor of one of them. The gals naturally wish to save the scalps of such friends, and they will give them 2 ivory creatures as ransom, 1 for each scalp. Go back and tell this to your chiefs, and bring me the answer before the sun sets." The boy entered zealously into this project, and with a sincerity that left no doubt of his executing his commission with intelligence and promptitude. For a moment he forgot his love of honor, and all his clannish hostility to the British and their Indians, in his wish to have such a treasure in his tribe, and Deerslayer was satisfied with the impression he had made. It is true the lad proposed to carry one of the elephants with him as a specimen of the other, but to this his brother negotiator was too sagacious to consent, well knowing that it might never reach its destination if confided to such hands. This little difficulty was soon arranged, and the boy prepared to depart. As he stood on the platform, ready to step aboard of the raft, he hesitated, and turned short with a proposal to borrow a canoe, as the means most likely to shorten the negotiations. Deerslayer quietly refused the request, and after lingering a little longer, the boy rowed slowly away from the castle, taking the direction of a thicket on the shore that lay less than half a mile distant. Deerslayer seated himself on a stool, and watched the progress of the ambassador, sometimes closely scanning the whole line of shore, as far as eye could reach, and then placing an elbow on a knee, he remained a long time with his chin resting on the hand. During the interview between Deerslayer and the lad, a different scene took place in the adjoining room. Hetty had inquired for the Delaware, and being told why and where he remained concealed, she joined him. The reception which Chingachgook gave his visitor was respectful and gentle. He understood her character, and no doubt his disposition to be kind to such a being was increased by the hope of learning some tidings of his betrothed. As soon as the girl entered she took a seat, and invited the Indian to place himself near her. Then she continued silent, as if she thought it decorous for him to question her, before she consented to speak on the subject she had in her mind. But, as Chingachgook did not understand this feeling, he remained respectfully attentive to any thing she might be pleased to tell him. "You are Chingachgook, the Great Serpent of the Delawares, aren't you?" the girl at length commenced, in her own simple way, losing her self-command in the desire to proceed, but anxious first to make sure of the individual. "Chingachgook," returned the Delaware, with grave dignity. "That say Great Sarpent, in Deerslayer tongue." "Well, that is my tongue. Deerslayer, and father, and Judith, and I, and poor Hurry Harry. Do you know Henry March, Great Serpent? I know you don't, however, or he would have spoken of you too." "Did any tongue name Chingachgook, Drooping Lily?" for so the chief had named poor Hetty. "Was his name sung by a little bird among Iroquois?" Hetty did not answer at first, but with that indescribable feeling that awakens sympathy and intelligence among the youthful and unpractised of her sex, she hung her head, and the blood suffused her cheek ere she found her tongue. It would have exceeded her stock of intelligence to explain this embarrassment; but, though poor Hetty could not reason, on every emergency, she could always feel. The color slowly receded from her cheeks, and the girl looked up archly at the Indian, smiling with the innocence of a child, mingled with the interest of a woman. "My sister, the Drooping Lily, hear such bird," Chingachgook added, and this with a gentleness of tone and manner that would have astonished those who sometimes heard the discordant cries that often came from the same throat, these transitions from the harsh and guttural to the soft and melodious not being infrequent in ordinary Indian dialogues. "My sister's ears were open. Has she lost her tongue? You are Chingachgook. You must be, for there is no other red man here, and she thought Chingachgook would come." Chingachgook, pronouncing the name slowly and dwelling on each syllable. "Great Sarpent, Yengeese tongue." It is singular there should be any question concerning the origin of the well-known sobriquet of Yankees. Nearly all the old writers who speak of the Indians first known to the colonists make them pronounce the word English as Yengeese. Even at this day, it is a provincialism of New England to say English instead of English, and there is a close conformity of sound between English and Yengeese, more especially if the latter word, as was probably the case, be pronounced short. The transition from Yengeese, thus pronounced, to Yankees is quite easy. If the former is pronounced Yangis, it is almost identical with Yankees, and Indian words have seldom been spelt as they are pronounced. Thus the scene of this tale is spelt Otsego, and is properly pronounced Otsego. The liquids of the Indians would easily convert N into Yen. "Chingachgook," repeated Hetty, in the same deliberate manner. "Yes, so Hist called it, and you must be the chief." "Wah-ta-Wah," added the Delaware. "Wah-ta-Wah, or Hist-oh-Hist. I think Hist prettier than Wah, and so I call her Hist. Wah very sweet in Delaware ears." "You make it sound differently from me, but never mind. I did hear the bird you speak of sing, Great Serpent." "Will my sister say words of song? What she sing most? How she look? Often she laugh?" "She sang Chingachgook oftener than any thing else, and she laughed heartily, when I told how the Iroquois waded into the water after us, and couldn't catch us. I hope these logs haven't ears, Serpent." "No fear logs. Fear sister next room. No fear Iroquois. Deerslayer stuff his eyes and ears with strange beast." "I understand you, Serpent, and I understood Hist. Sometimes I think I'm not half as feeble-minded as they say I am. Now, do you look up at the roof, and I'll tell you all. But you frighten me, you look so eager when I speak of Hist." The Indian controlled his looks, and affected to comply with the simple request of the girl. "Hist told me to say in a very low voice that you mustn't trust the Iroquois in anything. They are more artful than any Indians she knows. Then she says that there is a large bright star that comes over the hill about an hour after dark." Hist had pointed out the planet Jupiter without knowing it. "And just as that star comes in sight, she will be on the point, where I landed last night, and that you must come for her, in a canoe." "Good. Chingachgook understand well enough, now, but he understand better if my sisters sing him ag'in." Hetty repeated her words, more fully explaining what star was meant, and mentioning the part of the point where he was to venture ashore. She now proceeded in her own unsophisticated way to relate her intercourse with the Indian maid, and to repeat several of her expressions and opinions that gave great delight to the heart of her betrothed. She particularly renewed her injunctions to be on their guard against treachery, a warning that was scarcely needed, however, as addressed to men as wary as those to whom it was sent. She also explained with sufficient clearness, for on all such subjects the mind of the girl seldom failed her, the present state of the enemy, and the movements they had made since morning. Hist had been on the raft with her until it quitted the shore, and was now somewhere in the woods, opposite to the castle, and did not intend to return to the camp until night approached, when she hoped to be able to slip away from her companions as they followed the shore on their way home, and conceal herself on the point. No one appeared to suspect the presence of Chingachgook, though it was necessarily known that an Indian had entered the Ark the previous night, and it was suspected that he had since appeared in and about the castle, in the dress of a pale-face. Still some little doubt existed on the latter point, for as this was the season when white men might be expected to arrive, there was some fear that the garrison of the castle was increasing by these ordinary means. All this had Hist communicated to Hetty, while the Indians were dragging them along shore, the distance, which exceeded 6 miles, affording abundance of time. "Hist don't know, herself, whether they suspect her or not, or whether they suspect you, but she hopes neither is the case. And now, Serpent, since I have told you so much from your betrothed," continued Hetty, unconsciously taking one of the Indian's hands and playing with the fingers, as a child is often seen to play with those of a parent, "you must let me tell you something from myself. When you marry Hist, you must be kind to her, and smile on her, as you do now on me, and not look cross, as some of the chiefs do at their squaws. Will you promise this?" "Alway, good to Wah. Too tender to twist hard, else she break." "Yes, and smile, too. You don't know how much a girl craves smiles from them she loves. Father scarce smiled on me once, while I was with him, and Hurry, yes, Hurry talked loud and laughed, but I don't think he smiled once either. You know the difference between a smile and a laugh?" "Laugh best. Hear Wah laugh, think birds sing." "I know that. Her laugh is pleasant. But you must smile, and then, Serpent, you mustn't make her carry burthens, and hoe corn, as so many Indians do, but treat her more as the pale faces treat their wives." "Wah ta Wah no pale face. Got red skin, red heart, red feelin's, all red. No pale face. Must carry papoose." "Every woman is willing to carry her child," said Hetty, smiling, "and there is no harm in that, but you must love Hist, and be gentle and good to her, for she is gentle and good herself." Chingachgook gravely bowed, and then he seemed to think this part of the subject might be dismissed. Before there was time for Hetty to resume her communications, the voice of Deerslayer was heard calling on his friend, in the outer room. At this summons the Serpent rose to obey, and Hetty joined her sister. Chapter 13. Recording by Bill Borst. The Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 14. "A stranger animal," cries one, "sure never lived beneath the sun. A lizard's body, lean and long, a fish's head, a serpent's tongue, its foot with triple claw disjoined, and what a length of tail behind." James Merrick, The Chameleon, 11, lines 21 through 26. The first act of the Delaware, on rejoining his friend, was to proceed gravely to disencumber himself of his civilized attire, and to stand forth an Indian warrior again. The protest of Deerslayer was met by his communicating the fact that the presence of an Indian in the hut was known to the Iroquois, and that maintaining the disguise would be more likely to direct suspicions to his real object, than if he came out openly as a member of a hostile tribe. When the latter understood the truth, and was told that he had been deceived in supposing the chief had succeeded in entering the Ark undiscovered, he cheerfully consented to the change, since further attempt at concealment was useless. A gentler feeling than the one avowed, however, lay at the bottom of the Indian's desire to appear as a son of the forest. He had been told that Hist was on the opposite shore, and nature so far triumphed over all distinctions of habit, and tribes and people, as to reduce this young savage warrior to the level of a feeling which would have been found in the most refined inhabitant of a town, under similar circumstances. There was a mild satisfaction in believing that she he loved could see him, and as he walked out on the platform in his scanty native attire, an Apollo of the wilderness, 100 of the tender fancies that fleet through lovers' brains beset his imagination, and softened his heart. All this was lost on Deerslayer, who was no great adept in the mysteries of Cupid, but whose mind was far more occupied with the concerns that forced themselves on his attention than with any of the truant fancies of love. He soon recalled his companion, therefore, to a sense of their actual condition, by summoning him to a sort of council of war, in which they were to settle their future course. In the dialogue that followed, the parties mutually made each other acquainted with what had passed in their several interviews. Chingachgook was told the history of the treaty about the ransom, and Deerslayer heard the whole of Hetty's communications. The latter listened with generous interest to his friend's hopes, and promised cheerfully all the assistance he could lend. "'Tis our main ar'n'd, Sarpent, as you know, this battling for the castle and old Hutter's darters coming in as a sort of accident." "Yes, yes. I'll be active in helping little Hist, who's not only one of the best and handsomest maidens of the tribe, but the very best and handsomest. I've always encouraged you, chief, in that liking, and it's proper, too, that a great and ancient race like your'n shouldn't come to an end. If a woman of red skin and red gifts could get to be near enough to me to wish her for a wife, I'd s'arch for just such another. But that can never be. No, that can never be. I'm glad Hetty has met with Hist, however, for though the first is a little short of wit and understanding, the last has enough for both. Yes, Sarpent," laughing heartily, "put 'em together, and two smarter gals isn't to be found in all York Colony." "I will go to the Iroquois camp," returned the Delaware gravely. "No one knows Chingachgook but Wah, and a treaty for lives and scalps should be made by a chief. Give me the strange beasts, and let me take a canoe." Deerslayer dropped his head and played with the end of a fish pole in the water, as he sat dangling his legs over the edge of the platform, like a man who was lost in thought by the sudden occurrence of a novel idea. Instead of directly answering the proposal of his friend, he began to soliloquize, a circumstance, however, that in no manner rendered his words more true, as he was remarkable for saying what he thought, whether the remarks were addressed to himself, or to any one else. "Yes, yes," he said, "this must be what they call love. I've heard say that it sometimes upsets reason altogether, leaving a young man as helpless as to calculation and caution as a brute beast. To think that the Sarpent should be so lost to reason, and cunning, and wisdom! We must sartainly manage to get Hist off, and have 'em married as soon as we get back to the tribe, or this war will be of no more use to the chief than a hunt a little oncommon extr'ornary. Yes, yes, he'll never be the man he was, till this matter is off his mind, and he comes to his senses like all the rest of mankind. Sarpent, you can't be in earnest, and therefore I shall say but little to your offer. But you're a chief, and will soon be sent out on the war path at head of the parties, and I'll just ask you if you'd think of putting your forces into the enemy's hands, afore the battle is fought." "Wah!" ejaculated the Indian. "Ay, wah! I know well enough it's wah, and altogether wah. Ra'ally, Sarpent, I'm concerned and mortified about you. I never heard so weak an idee come from a chief, and he, too, one that's already got a name for being wise, young and inexperienced as he is. Canoe you shan't have, so long as the vice of friendship and warning can count for anything." My pale-face friend is right. A cloud came over the face of Chingachgook, and weakness got into his mind, while his eyes were dim. My brother has a good memory for good deeds, and a weak memory for bad. He will forget. "Yes, that's easy enough. Say no more about it, chief. But if another of them clouds blow near you, do your endivours to get out of its way. Clouds are bad enough in the weather, but when they come to the reason, it gets to be serious. Now, sit down by me here, and let us calculate our movements a little, for we shall soon either have a truce and a peace, or we shall come to an active and bloody war. You see the vagabonds can make logs sarve their turn, as well as the best raftsmen on the rivers, and it would be no great expl'ite for them to invade us in a body. I've been thinking of the wisdom of putting all old Tom's stores into the Ark, of barring and locking up the castle, and of taking to the Ark altogether. That is movable, and by keeping the sail up, and shifting places, we might worry through a great many nights, without them Canada wolves finding a way into our sheepfold." Chingachgook listened to this plan with approbation. Did the negotiation fail, there was now little hope that the night would pass without an assault, and the enemy had sagacity enough to understand that in carrying the castle they would probably become masters of all it contained, the offered ransom included, and still retain the advantages they had hitherto gained. Some precaution of the sort appeared to be absolutely necessary, for now the numbers of the Iroquois were known, a night attack could scarcely be successfully met. It would be impossible to prevent the enemy from getting possession of the canoes and the Ark, and the latter itself would be a hold in which the assailants would be as effectually protected against bullets as were those in the building. For a few minutes, both the men thought of sinking the Ark in the shallow water, of bringing the canoes into the house, and of depending altogether on the castle for protection. But reflection satisfied them that, in the end, this expedient would fail. It was so easy to collect logs on the shore, and to construct a raft of almost any size, that it was certain the Iroquois, now they had turned their attention to such means, would resort to them seriously, so long as there was the certainty of success by perseverance. After deliberating maturely, and placing all the considerations fairly before them, the two young beginners in the art of forest warfare settled down into the opinion that the Ark offered the only available means of security. This decision was no sooner come to than it was communicated to Judith. The girl had no serious objection to make, and all four set about the measures necessary to carrying the plan into execution. The reader will readily understand that Floating Tom's worldly goods were of no great amount. A couple of beds, some wearing apparel, the arms and ammunition, a few cooking utensils, with the mysterious and but half examined chest formed the principal items. These were all soon removed, the Ark having been hauled on the eastern side of the building, so that the transfer could be made without being seen from the shore. It was thought unnecessary to disturb the heavier and coarser articles of furniture, as they were not required in the Ark, and were of but little value in themselves. As great caution was necessary in removing the different objects, most of which were passed out of a window with a view to conceal what was going on, it required 2 or 3 hours before all could be effected. By the expiration of that time, the raft made its appearance, moving from the shore. Deerslayer immediately had recourse to the glass, by the aid of which he perceived that 2 warriors were on it, though they appeared to be unarmed. The progress of the raft was slow, a circumstance that formed one of the great advantages that would be possessed by the scow, in any future collision between them, the movements of the latter being comparatively swift and light. As there was time to make the dispositions for the reception of the 2 dangerous visitors, everything was prepared for them, long before they had got near enough to be hailed. The Serpent and the girls retired into the building, where the former stood near the door, well provided with rifles, while Judith watched the proceedings without, through a loop. As for Deerslayer, he had brought a stool to the edge of the platform, at the point towards which the raft was advancing, and taken his seat with his rifle leaning carelessly between his legs. As the raft drew nearer, every means possessed by the party in the castle was resorted to, in order to ascertain if their visitors had any firearms. Neither Deerslayer nor Chingachgook could discover any, but Judith, unwilling to trust to simple eyesight, thrust the glass through the loop, and directed it towards the hemlock boughs that lay between the 2 logs of the raft, forming a sort of flooring, as well as a seat for the use of the rowers. When the heavy moving craft was within 50 feet of him, Deerslayer hailed the Hurons, directing them to cease rowing, it not being his intention to permit them to land. Compliance, of course, was necessary, and the 2 grim-looking warriors instantly quitted their seats, though the raft continued slowly to approach, until it had driven in much nearer to the platform. "Are ye chiefs?" demanded Deerslayer with dignity. "Are ye chiefs? Or have the Mingos sent me warriors without names on such an ar'n'd? If so, the sooner you go back, the sooner them will be likely to come that a warrior can talk with." "Hugh!" exclaimed the elder of the 2 on the raft, rolling his glowing eyes over the different objects that were visible in and about the castle, with a keenness that showed how little escaped him. "My brother is very proud, but Riven Oak," we use the literal translation of the term, writing as we do in English, "is a name to make a Delaware turn pale." "That's true, or it's a lie, Riven Oak, as it may be, but I am not likely to turn pale, seeing that I was born pale. What's your ar'n'd, and why do you come among the light bark canoes on logs that are not even dug out?" The Iroquois are not ducks to walk on water. Let the pale faces give them a canoe, and they'll come in a canoe. That's more rational than likely to come to pass. We have but 4 canoes, and being 4 persons, that's only one for each of us. We thank you for the offer, howsever, though we ask leave not to accept it. You are welcome, Iroquois, on your logs." "Thanks. My young pale-face warrior, he has got a name. How do the chiefs call him?" Deerslayer hesitated a moment, and a gleam of pride and human weakness came over him. He smiled, muttered between his teeth, and then looking up proudly, he said, "Mingo, like all who are young and active, I've been known by different names at different times. One of your warriors, whose spirit started for the happy grounds of your people, as lately as yesterday morning, thought I deserved to be known by the name of Hawkeye, and this because my sight happened to be quicker than his own, when it got to be life or death atween us." Chingachgook, who was attentively listening to all that passed, heard and understood this proof of passing weakness in his friend, and on a future occasion he questioned him more closely concerning the transaction on the point, where Deerslayer had first taken human life. When he had got the whole truth, he did not fail to communicate it to the tribe, from which time the young hunter was universally known among the Delawares by an appellation so honorably earned. As this, however, was a period posterior to all the incidents of this tale, we shall continue to call the young hunter by the name under which he has been first introduced to the reader. Nor was the Iroquois less struck with the vaunt of the white man. He knew of the death of his comrade, and had no difficulty in understanding the allusion, the intercourse between the conqueror and his victim on that occasion having been seen by several savages on the shore of the lake, who had been stationed at different points just within the margin of bushes to watch the drifting canoes, and who had not time to reach the scene of action ere the victor had retired. The effect on this rude being of the forest was an exclamation of surprise. Then such a smile of courtesy and wave of the hand succeeded, as would have done credit to Asiatic diplomacy. The 2 Iroquois spoke to each other in low tones, and both drew near the end of the raft that was closest to the platform. "My brother, Hawkeye, has sent a message to the Hurons," resumed Riven Oak, "and it has made their hearts very glad. They hear he has images of beasts with 2 tails. Will he show them to his friends?" "Inimies would be truer," returned Deerslayer, "but sound isn't sense, and does little harm. Here is one of the images. I toss it to you under the faith of treaties. If it's not returned, the rifle will settle the p'int atween us." The Iroquois seemed to acquiesce in the conditions, and Deerslayer arose and prepared to toss one of the elephants to the raft, both parties using all the precaution that was necessary to prevent its loss. As practice renders men expert in such things, the little piece of ivory was soon successfully transferred from one hand to the other, and then followed another scene on the raft, in which astonishment and delight got the mastery of Indian stoicism. These 2 grim old warriors manifested even more feeling, as they examined the curiously wrought chessman, than had been betrayed by the boy, for in the case of the latter, recent schooling had interposed its influence, while the men, like all who are sustained by well-established characters, were not ashamed to let some of their emotions be discovered. For a few minutes, they apparently lost the consciousness of their situation, in the intense scrutiny they bestowed on a material so fine, work so highly wrought, and an animal so extraordinary. The lip of the moose is perhaps the nearest approach to the trunk of the elephant that is to be found in the American forest, but this resemblance was far from being sufficiently striking to bring the new creature within the range of their habits and ideas, and the more they studied the image, the greater was their astonishment. Nor did these children of the forest mistake the structure on the back of the elephant for a part of the animal. They were familiar with horses and oxen, and had seen towers in the Canadas, and found nothing surprising in creatures of burthen. Still, by a very natural association, they supposed the carving meant to represent that the animal they saw was of a strength sufficient to carry a fort on its back, a circumstance that in no degree lessened their wonder. "Has my pale-face brother any more such beasts?" at last the senior of the Iroquois asked, in a sort of petitioning manner. "There's more where them came from, Mingo," was the answer. "One is enough, howsever, to buy off 50 scalps. One of my prisoners is a great warrior, tall as a pine, strong as the moose, active as a deer, fierce as the panther. Some day he'll be a great chief, and lead the army of King George." "Tut, tut, Mingo, Hurry Harry is Hurry Harry, and you'll never make more than a corporal of him if you do that. He's tall enough, of a sartainty, but that's of no use, as he only hits his head ag'in the branches as he goes through the forest. He's strong, too, but a strong body isn't a strong head, and the king's generals are not chosen for their sinews. He's swift, if you will, but a rifle bullet is swifter. And as for fierceness, it's no great ricommend to a soldier. They that think they feel the stoutest often givin' out at the pinch. No, no, you'll never make Hurry's scalp pass for more than a good head of curly hair, and a rattle-pate beneath it. My old prisoner very wise, King of the Lake, great warrior, wise counsellor." "Well, there's them that might gainsay all this, too, Mingo. A very wise man wouldn't be apt to be taken in so foolish a manner as befell Master Hutter, and if he gives good counsel, he must have listened to very bad in that affair. There's only one king of this lake, and he's a long way off, and isn't likely ever to see it. Floating Tom is some such king of this region, as the wolf that prowls through the woods is king of the forest. A beast with 2 tails is well worth 2 such scalps." "But my brother has another beast? He will give 2, holding up as many fingers, for old father?" "Floating Tom is no father of mine, but he'll fare none the worse for that. As for giving 2 beasts for his scalp, and each beast with 2 tails, it is quite beyond reason. Think yourself well off, Mingo, if you make a much worse trade." By this time the self-command of Riven Oak had got the better of his wonder, and he began to fall back on his usual habits of cunning, in order to drive the best bargain he could. It would be useless to relate more than the substance of the desultory dialogue that followed, in which the Indian manifested no little management in endeavoring to recover the ground lost under the influence of surprise. He even affected to doubt whether any original for the image of the beast existed, and asserted that the oldest Indian had never heard a tradition of any such animal. Little did either of them imagine, at the time, that, long ere a century elapsed, the progress of civilization would bring even much more extraordinary and rare animals into that region, as curiosities to be gazed at by the curious, and that the particular beast about which the disputants contended would be seen laving its sides and swimming in the very sheet of water on which they had met. The Otsego is a favorite place for the caravan keepers to let their elephants bathe. The writer has seen 2 at a time, since the publication of this book, swimming about in company. As is not uncommon on such occasions, one of the parties got a little warm in the course of the discussion, for Deerslayer met all the arguments and prevarication of his subtle opponent with his own cool directness of manner, and unmoved love of truth. What an elephant was he knew little better than the savage, but he perfectly understood that the carved pieces of ivory must have some such value in the eyes of an Iroquois as a bag of gold or a package of beaver skins would in those of a trader. Under the circumstances, therefore, he felt it to be prudent not to concede too much at first, since there existed a nearly unconquerable obstacle to making the transfers, even after the contracting parties had actually agreed upon the terms. Keeping this difficulty in view, he held the extra chessmen in reserve, as a means of smoothing any difficulty in the moment of need. At length the savage pretended that further negotiation was useless, since he could not be so unjust to his tribe as to part with the honor and emoluments of 2 excellent full-grown male scalps, for a consideration so trifling as a toy like that he had seen, and he prepared to take his departure. Both parties now felt as men are wont to feel, when a bargain that each is anxious to conclude is on the eve of being broken off, in consequence of too much pertinacity in the way of management. The effect of the disappointment was very different, however, on the respective individuals. Deerslayer was mortified and filled with regret, for he not only felt for the prisoners, but he also felt deeply for the 2 girls. The conclusion of the treaty, therefore, left him melancholy and full of regret. With the savage, his defeat produced the desire of revenge. In a moment of excitement he had loudly announced his intention to say no more, and he felt equally enraged with himself and with his cool opponent that he had permitted a pale-face to manifest more indifference and self-command than an Indian chief. When he began to urge his raft away from the platform, his countenance lowered and his eye glowed, even while he affected a smile of amity and a gesture of courtesy at parting. It took some little time to overcome the inertia of the logs, and while this was being done by the silent Indian, Riven Oak stalked over the hemlock boughs that lay between the logs in sullen ferocity, eyeing keenly the while the hut, the platform, and the person of his late disputant. Once he spoke in low, quick tones to his companion, and he stirred the boughs with his feet like an animal that is restive. At that moment the watchfulness of Deerslayer had a little abated, for he sat musing on the means of renewing the negotiation without giving too much advantage to the other side. It was perhaps fortunate for him that the keen and bright eyes of Judith were as vigilant as ever. At the instant when the young man was least on his guard, and his enemy was the most on the alert, she called out in a warning voice to the former, most opportunely giving the alarm. "Be on your guard, Deerslayer," the girl cried. "I see rifles, with the glass, beneath the hemlock brush, and the Iroquois is loosening them with his feet." It would seem that the enemy had carried their artifices so far as to employ an agent who understood English. The previous dialogue had taken place in his own language, but it was evident by the sudden manner in which his feet ceased their treacherous occupation, and in which the countenance of Riven Oak changed from sullen ferocity to a smile of courtesy, that the call of the girl was understood. Signing to his companion to cease his efforts to set the logs in motion, he advanced to the end of the raft, which was nearest to the platform, and spoke. "Why should Riven Oak and his brother leave any cloud between them?" he said. "They are both wise, both brave, and both generous. They ought to part friends. One beast shall be the price of one prisoner." "And Mingo," answered the other, delighted to renew the negotiations on almost any terms, and determined to clinch the bargain, if possible, by a little extra liberality. "You'll see that a pale-face knows how to pay a full price, when he trades with an open heart, and an open hand. Keep the beast that you had forgotten to give back to me, as you was about to start, and which I forgot to ask for on account of consarn at parting in anger. Show it to your chiefs. When you bring us our friends, 2 more shall be added to it, and," hesitating a moment in distrust of the expediency of so great a concession, then deciding in its favor, "and, if we see them before the sun sets, we may find a 4th to make up an even number." This settled the matter. Every gleam of discontent vanished from the dark countenance of the Iroquois, and he smiled as graciously, if not as sweetly, as Judith Hutter herself. The piece already in his possession was again examined, and an ejaculation of pleasure showed how much he was pleased with this unexpected termination of the affair. In point of fact, both he and Deerslayer had momentarily forgotten what had become the subject of their discussion, in the warmth of their feelings, but such had not been the case with Riven Oak's companion. This man retained the piece, and had fully made up his mind, were it claimed under such circumstances as to render its return necessary, to drop it in the lake, trusting to his being able to find it again at some future day. This desperate expedient, however, was no longer necessary, and after repeating the terms of agreement, and professing to understand them, the 2 Indians finally took their departure, moving slowly towards the shore. "Can any faith be put in such wretches?" asked Judith, when she and Hetty had come out on the platform and were standing at the side of Deerslayer, watching the dull movement of the logs. "Will they not rather keep the toy they have, and send us off some bloody proofs of their getting the better of us in cunning, by way of boasting? I've heard of acts as bad as this." "No doubt, Judith, no manner of doubt, if it wasn't for Indian natur'. But I'm no judge of a red skin, if that 2-tailed beast doesn't set the whole tribe in some such stir as a stick raises in a beehive. Now, there's the Sarpent, a man with narves like flint, and no more curiosity in every day consarns than is befitting prudence. Why, he was so overcome with the sight of the creatur', carved as it is in bone, that I felt ashamed for him. That's just their gifts, howsever. and one can't quarrel with a man for his gifts, when they are lawful. Chingachgook will soon get over his weakness, and remember that he's a chief, and that he comes of a great stock, and has a renowned name to support and uphold. But as for yonder scamps, there'll be no peace among 'em, till they think they've got possession of every thing of the natur' of that bit of carved bone that's to be found among Thomas Hutter's stores. They only know of the elephants, and can have no hopes about the other things." "That's true, Judith. Still, covetousness is a craving feelin'. They'll say, if the pale faces have these curious beasts with 2 tails, who knows but they've got some with 3, or for that matter with 4. That's what the schoolmasters call nat'ral arithmetic, and 'twill be sartain to beset the feelin's of savages. They'll never be easy, till the truth is known." "Do you think, Deerslayer," inquired Hetty, in her simple and innocent manner, "that the Iroquois won't let father and Hurry go? I read to them several of the very best verses in the whole Bible, and you see what they have done, already." The hunter, as he always did, listened kindly and even affectionately to Hetty's remarks. Then he mused a moment in silence. There was something like a flush on his cheek as he answered, after quite a minute had passed. "I don't know whether a white man ought to be ashamed, or not, to own he can't read. But such is my case, Judith. You are skilful, I find, in all such matters, while I have only studied the hand of God as it is seen in the hills and the valleys, the mountain tops, the streams, the forests, and the springs. Much l'arning may be got in this way, as well as out of books, and yet I sometimes think it is a white man's gift to read. When I hear from the mouths of the Moravians the words of which Hetty speaks, they raise a longing in my mind, and I then think I will know how to read 'em myself. But the game in summer, and the traditions, and lessons in war, and other matters, have always kept me behindhand." "Shall I teach you, Deerslayer?" asked Hetty, earnestly. "I'm weak-minded, they say, but I can read as well as Judith. It might save your life to know how to read the Bible to the savages, and it will certainly save your soul, for mother told me that, again and again." "Thankee, Hetty. Yes, thankee, with all my heart. These are like to be too stirring times for much idleness. But after it's peace, and I come to see you again on this lake, then I'll give myself up to it, as if 'twas pleasure and profit in a single business. Perhaps I ought to be ashamed, Judith, that 'tis so, but truth is truth. As for these Iroquois, 'tisn't very likely they'll forget a beast with 2 tails, on account of a varse or 2 from the Bible. I rather expect they'll give up the prisoners, and trust to some sarcumvention or other to get 'em back ag'in with us and all in the castle and the ark in the bargain. Howsever, we must humor the vagabonds, first to get your father and Hurry out of their hands, and next to keep the peace atween us, until such time as the Sarpent there can make out to get off his betrothed wife. If there's any sudden outbreakin' of anger and ferocity, the Indians will send off all their women and children to the camp at once; whereas, by keepin' 'em calm and trustful, we may manage to meet Hist at the spot she has mentioned. Rather than have the bargain fall through, now, I'd throw in half a dozen of them effigy bow and arrow men, such as we've in plenty in the chist." Judith cheerfully assented, for she would have resigned even the flowered brocade, rather than not redeem her father and please Deerslayer. The prospects of success were now so encouraging as to raise the spirits of all in the castle, though a due watchfulness of the movements of the enemy was maintained. Hour passed after hour, notwithstanding, and the sun had once more begun to fall towards the summits of the western hills, and yet no signs were seen of the return of the raft. By dint of sweeping the shore with the glass, Deerslayer at length discovered a place in the dense and dark woods where, he entertained no doubt, the Iroquois were assembled in considerable numbers. It was near the thicket whence the craft had issued, and a little rill that trickled into the lake announced the vicinity of a spring. Here, then, the savages were probably holding their consultation, and the decision was to be made that went to settle the question of life or death for the prisoners. There was one ground for hope in spite of the delay, however, that Deerslayer did not fail to place before his anxious companions. It was far more probable that the Indians had left their prisoners in the camp, than that they had encumbered themselves by causing them to follow through the woods a party that was out on a merely temporary excursion. If such was the fact, it required considerable time to send a messenger the necessary distance, and to bring the two white men to the spot where they were to embark. Encouraged by these reflections, a new stock of patience was gathered, and the declension of the sun was viewed with less alarm. The result justified Deerslayer's conjecture. Not long before the sun had finally disappeared, the two logs were seen coming out of the thicket again, and as it drew near, Judith announced that her father and Hurry, both of them pinioned, lay on the bushes in the centre. As before, the two Indians were rowing. The latter seemed to be conscious that the lateness of the hour demanded unusual exertions, and contrary to the habits of their people, who are ever averse to toil, they labored hard at the rude substitutes for oars. In consequence of this diligence, the raft occupied its old station in about half the time that had been taken in the previous visits. Even after the conditions were so well understood, and matters had proceeded so far, the actual transfer of the prisoners was not a duty to be executed without difficulty. The Iroquois were compelled to place great reliance on the good faith of their foes, though it was reluctantly given, and was yielded to necessity rather than to confidence. As soon as Hutter and Hurry should be released, the party in the castle numbered 2 to 1, as opposed to those on the raft, and escape by flight was out of the question, as the former had 3 bark canoes, to say nothing of the defences of the house and the ark. All this was understood by both parties, and it is probable the arrangement never could have been completed, had not the honest countenance and manner of Deerslayer wrought their usual effect on Riven Oak. "My brother knows I put faith in him," said the latter, as he advanced with Hutter, whose legs had been released to enable the old man to ascend to the platform. "One scalp, one more beast." "Stop, Mingo," interrupted the hunter. "Keep your prisoner a moment. I have to go and seek the means of payment." This excuse, however, though true in part, was principally a fetch. Deerslayer left the platform, and entering the house, he directed Judith to collect all the arms and to conceal them in her own room. He then spoke earnestly to the Delaware, who stood on guard as before, near the entrance of the building, put the 3 remaining castles in his pocket, and returned. "You are welcome back to your old abode, Master Hutter," said Deerslayer, as he helped the other up on the platform, slyly passing into the hand of Riven Oak at the same time another of the castles. "You'll find your darters right glad to see you, and here's Hetty come herself to say as much in her own behalf." Here the hunter stopped speaking, and broke out into a hearty fit of his silent and peculiar laughter. Hurry's legs were just released, and he had been placed on his feet. So tightly had the ligatures been drawn, that the use of his limbs was not immediately recovered, and the young giant presented, in good sooth, a very helpless and a somewhat ludicrous picture. It was this unusual spectacle, particularly the bewildered countenance, that excited the merriment of Deerslayer. "You look like a girdled pine in a clearin', Hurry Harry, that is rocking in a gale," said Deerslayer, checking his unseasonable mirth, more from delicacy to the others than from any respect to the liberated captive. "I'm glad, howsever, to see that you haven't had your hair dressed by any of the Iroquois barbers, in your late visit to their camp." "Harkee, Deerslayer," returned the other a little fiercely, "it will be prudent for you to deal less in mirth and more in friendship on this occasion. Act like a Christian, for once, and not like a laughing gal in a country school when the master's back is turned, and just tell me whether there's any feet, or not, at the end of these legs of mine. I think I can see them, but as for feelin', they might as well be down on the banks of the Mohawk, as be where they seem to be." "You've come off whole, Hurry, and that's not a little," answered the other, secretly passing to the Indian the remainder of the stipulated ransom, and making an earnest sign at the same moment for him to commence his retreat. "You've come off whole, feet and all, and are only a little numb from a tight fit of the withes. Nature'll soon set the blood in motion, and then you may begin to dance to celebrate what I call a most wonderful and unexpected deliverance from a den of wolves." Deerslayer released the arms of his friends as each landed, and the two were now stamping and limping about on the platform, growling and uttering denunciations as they endeavored to help the returning circulation. They had been tethered too long, however, to regain the use of their limbs in a moment, and the Indians being quite as diligent on their return as on their advance, The raft was fully 100 yards from the castle when Hurry, turning accidentally in that direction, discovered how fast it was getting beyond the reach of his vengeance. By this time he could move with tolerable facility, though still numb and awkward. Without considering his own situation, however, he seized the rifle that leaned against the shoulder of Deerslayer, and attempted to cock and present it. The young hunter was too quick for him. Seizing the piece, he wrenched it from the hands of the giant, not, however, until it had gone off in the struggle, when pointed directly upward. It is probable that Deerslayer could have prevailed in such a contest, on account of the condition of Hurry's limbs, but the instant the gun went off, the latter yielded, and stumped towards the house, raising his legs at each step quite a foot from the ground, from an uncertainty of the actual position of his feet. But he had been anticipated by Judith. The whole stock of Hutter's arms, which had been left in the building as a resource in the event of a sudden outbreaking of hostilities, had been removed, and were already secreted, agreeably to Deerslayer's directions. In consequence of this precaution, no means offered by which March could put his designs in execution. Hurry seated himself, and like Hutter, for half an hour he was too much occupied in endeavoring to restore the circulation, and in regaining the use of his limbs, to indulge in any other reflections. By the end of this time the raft had disappeared, and night was beginning to throw her shadows once more over the whole sylvan scene. Before darkness had completely set in, and while the girls were preparing the evening meal, Deerslayer related to Hutter an outline of events that had taken place, and gave him a history of the means he had adopted for the security of his children and property. Chapter 14. Recording by Bill Borst. Of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 15. As long as Edwarda rules this lande, nequiet you wile ye know. Your sonnes and husbandes shall be slain, and brooks with bloode shall flowa. You leave your a god and lawful king, when in adversity. Like me and toa the true cause steek, and for the true cause dia. Chatterton. The calm of evening was again in singular contrast, while its gathering gloom was in singular unison with the passions of men. The sun was set, and the rays of the retiring luminary had ceased to gild the edges of the few clouds that had sufficient openings to admit the passage of its fading light. The canopy overhead was heavy and dense, promising another night of darkness, but the surface of the lake was scarcely disturbed by a ripple. There was a little air, though it scarce deserved to be termed wind. Still, being damp and heavy, it had a certain force. The party in the castle were as gloomy and silent as the scene. The two ransomed prisoners felt humbled and discolored, but their humility partook of the rancor of revenge. They were far more disposed to remember the indignity with which they had been treated during the last few hours of their captivity, than to feel grateful for the previous indulgence. Then that keen-sighted monitor, conscience, by reminding them of the retributive justice of all they had endured, goaded them rather to turn the tables on their enemies than to accuse themselves. As for the others, they were thoughtful, equally from regret and joy. Deerslayer and Judith felt most of the former sensation, though from very different causes, while Hetty, for the moment, was perfectly happy. The Delaware had also lively pictures of felicity in the prospect of so soon regaining his betrothed. Under such circumstances, and in this mood, all were taking the evening meal. "Old Tom," cried Hurry, bursting into a fit of boisterous laughter, "you looked amazingly like a tethered bear as you was stretched on them hemlock boughs, and I only wonder you didn't growl more. Well, it's over, and syths and lamentations won't mend the matter. There's the blackguard Riven Oak, he that brought us off has an uncommon scalp, and I'd give as much for it myself as the colony. Yes, I feel as rich as the governor in these matters now, and will lay down with them doubloon for doubloon. Judith, darling, did you mourn for me much, when I was in the hands of the Philipsteins?" The last were a family of German descent on the Mohawk, to whom Hurry had a great antipathy, and whom he had confounded with the enemies of Judea. "Our tears have raised the lake, Hurry March, as you might have seen by the shore," returned Judith, with a feigned levity that she was far from feeling. "That Hetty and I should have grieved for father was to be expected, but we fairly rained tears for you." "We were sorry for poor Hurry, as well as for father, Judith," put in her innocent and unconscious sister. "True, girl, true; but we feel sorrow for everybody that's in trouble, you know," returned the other, in a quick, admonitory manner, and a low tone. "Nevertheless, we are glad to see you, Master March, and out of the hands of the Philipsteins, too." "Yes, they're a bad set, and so is the other brood of 'em down on the river. It's a wonderment to me how you got us off, Deerslayer, and I forgive you the interference that prevented my doin' justice on that vagabond for this small service. Let us into the secret, that we may do you the same turn, at need. Was it by lying, or by coaxing?" "By neither, Hurry, but by buying. We paid a ransom for you both, and that, too, at a price so high you would well be on your guard ag'in another captivement, lest our stock of goods shouldn't hold out." "A ransom! Old Tom has paid the fiddler, then, for nothing of mine would have bought off the hair, much less the skin. I didn't think men as keen set as them vagabonds would let a fellow up so easy, when they had him fairly at a close hug, and floored. But money is money, and somehow it's unnat'ral hard to withstand. Indian or white man, 'tis pretty much the same. It must be owned, Judith, there's a considerable of human natur' in mankind ginirally, arter all." Hutter now rose, and signing to Deerslayer, as he led him to an inner room, where, in answer to his questions, he first learned the price that had been paid for his release. The old man expressed neither resentment nor surprise at the inroad that had been made on his chest, though he did manifest some curiosity to know how far the investigations of its contents had been carried. He also inquired where the key had been found. The habitual frankness of Deerslayer prevented any prevarication, and the conference soon terminated by the return of the two to the outer room, or that which served for the double purpose of parlor and kitchen. "I wonder if it's peace or war between us and the savages!" exclaimed Hurry, just as Deerslayer, who had paused for a single instant, listened attentively, and was passing through the outer door without stopping. "This giving up captives has a friendly look, and when men have traded together on a fair and honorable footing, they ought to part fri'nds, for that occasion at least. Come back, Deerslayer, and let us have your judgment, for I'm beginning to think more of you since your late behavior than I used to do." "There's an answer to your question, Hurry, since you're in such haste to come ag'in to blows." As Deerslayer spoke, he threw on the table, on which the other was reclining with one elbow, a sort of miniature faggot, composed of a dozen sticks, bound tightly together with a deerskin thong. March seized it eagerly, and holding it close to a blazing knot of pine that lay on the hearth, and which gave out all the light there was in the room, ascertained that the ends of the several sticks had been dipped in blood. "If this isn't plain English," said the reckless frontier man, "it's plain Indian. Here's what they call a declaration of war down at York, Judith. How did you come by this defiance, Deerslayer?" "Fairly enough. It lay not a minute since, in what you call Floatin' Tom's door yard." "How came it there?" "It never fell from the clouds, Judith, as little toads sometimes do, and then it don't rain." "You must prove where it come from, Deerslayer, or we shall suspect some design to skear them that would have lost their wits long ago, if fear could drive 'em away." Deerslayer had approached a window, and cast a glance out of it on the dark aspect of the lake. As if satisfied with what he beheld, he drew near Hurry, and took the bundle of sticks into his own hand, examining it attentively. "Yes, this is an Indian declaration of war, sure enough," he said, "and it's a proof how little you're suited to be on the path it has travelled, Harry March, that it has got here, and you never the wiser as to the means. The savages may have left the scalp on your head, but they must have taken off the ears, else you'd have heard the stirring of the water made by the lad as he come off again on his two logs. His ar'n'd was to throw these sticks at our door, as much as to say, We've struck the war post since the trade, and the next thing will be to strike you. The prowling wolves but hand me that rifle, Judith, and I'll send an answer back to the vagabonds through their messenger." "Not while I stand by, Master March," coolly put in Deerslayer, motioning for the other to forbear. "Faith is faith, whether given to a red skin or to a Christian. The lad lighted a knot, and came off fairly under its blaze to give us this warning, and no man here should harm him while empl'yed on such an ar'n'd. There's no use in words, for the boy is too cunning to leave the knot burning, now his business is done, and the night is already too dark for a rifle to have any sartainty." "That may be true enough as to a gun, but there's virtue still in a canoe," answered Hurry, passing towards the door with enormous strides, carrying a rifle in his hands. "The being doesn't live that shall stop me from following and bringing back that riptyle's scalp. The more on 'em that you crush in the egg, the fewer there'll be to dart at you in the woods." Judith trembled like the aspen. She scarce knew why herself, though there was the prospect of a scene of violence. For if Hurry was fierce and overbearing in the consciousness of his vast strength, Deerslayer had about him the calm determination that promises greater perseverance, and a resolution more likely to effect its object. It was the stern, resolute eye of the latter, rather than the noisy vehemence of the first, that excited her apprehensions. Hurry soon reached the spot where the canoe was fastened, but not before Deerslayer had spoken in a quick, earnest voice to the Serpent, in Delaware. The latter had been the first, in truth, to hear the sounds of the oars, and he had gone upon the platform in jealous watchfulness. The light satisfied him that a message was coming, and when the boy cast his bundle of sticks at his feet, it neither moved his anger nor induced surprise. He merely stood at watch, rifle in hand, to make certain that no treachery lay behind the defiance. As Deerslayer now called to him, he stepped into the canoe, and quick as thought removed the paddles. Hurry was furious when he found that he was deprived of the means of proceeding. He first approached the Indian with loud menaces, and even Deerslayer stood aghast at the probable consequences. March shook his sledge-hammer fists, and flourished his arms as he drew near the Indian, and all expected he would attempt to fell the Delaware to the earth. One of them, at least, was well aware that such an experiment would be followed by immediate bloodshed. But even Hurry was awed by the stern composure of the chief, and he, too, knew that such a man was not to be outraged with impunity. He therefore turned to vent his rage on Deerslayer, where he foresaw no consequences so terrible. What might have been the result of this second demonstration, if completed, is unknown, since it was never made. "Hurry," said a gentle, soothing voice at his elbow, "it's wicked to be so angry, and God will not overlook it. The Iroquois treated you well, and they didn't take your scalp, though you and father wanted to take theirs." The influence of mildness on passion is well known. Hetty, too, had earned a sort of consideration, that had never before been enjoyed by her, through the self-devotion and decision of her recent conduct. Perhaps her established mental imbecility, by removing all distrust of a wish to control, aided her influence. Let the cause be as questionable as it might, the effect was sufficiently certain. Instead of throttling his old fellow traveler, Hurry turned to the girl and poured out a portion of his discontent, if none of his anger, in her attentive ears. "'Tis too bad, Hetty," he exclaimed, "as bad as a county jail, or a lack of beaver, to get a creatur' into your very trap, than to see it get off. As much as 6 first quality skins, in valie, has paddled off on them clumsy logs, when 20 strokes of a well turned paddle would overtake 'em. I say in valie, for as to the boy in the way of natur', he is only a boy, and is worth neither more nor less than one. Deerslayer, you've been ontrue to your fri'nds, in letting such a chance slip through my fingers as well as your own." The answer was given quietly, but with a voice as steady as a fearless nature and the consciousness of rectitude could make it. "I should have been untrue to the right, had I done otherwise," returned the Deerslayer steadily, "and neither you nor any other man has the authority to demand that much of me. The lad came on a lawful business, and the meanest red skin that roams the woods would be ashamed of not respecting his ar'n'd. But he's now far beyond your reach, Master March, and there's little use in talking, like a couple of women, of what can no longer be helped." So saying, Deerslayer turned away, like one resolved to waste no more words on the subject, while Hutter pulled Harry by the sleeve and led him into the Ark. There they sat long in private conference. In the meantime, the Indian and his friend had their secret consultation; for though it wanted some 3 or 4 hours to the rising of the star, the former could not abstain from canvassing his scheme, and from opening his heart to the other. Judith, too, yielded to her softer feelings, and listened to the whole of Hetty's artless narrative of what occurred after she landed. The woods had few terrors for either of these girls, educated as they had been, and accustomed as they were to look out daily at their rich expanse, or to wander beneath their dark shades. But the elder sister felt that she would have hesitated about thus venturing alone into an Iroquois camp. Concerning Hist, Hetty was not very communicative. She spoke of her kindness and gentleness, and of the meeting in the forest, but the secret of Chingachgook was guarded with a shrewdness and fidelity that many a sharper-witted girl might have failed to display. At length the several conferences were broken up by the reappearance of Hutter on the platform. Here he assembled the whole party, and communicated as much of his intentions as he deemed expedient. Of the arrangement made by Deerslayer, to abandon the castle during the night and to take refuge in the Ark, he entirely approved. It struck him, as it had the others, as the only effectual means of escaping destruction. Now that the savages had turned their attention to the construction of rafts, no doubt could exist of their at least making an attempt to carry the building, and the message of the bloody sticks sufficiently showed their confidence in their own success. In short, the old man viewed the night as critical, and he called on all to get ready as soon as possible, in order to abandon the dwellings, temporarily at least, if not forever. These communications made, everything proceeded promptly and with intelligence. The castle was secured in the manner already described, the canoes were withdrawn from the dock and fastened to the Ark by the side of the other, the few necessaries that had been left in the house were transferred to the cabin, the fire was extinguished, and all embarked. The vicinity of the hills, with their drapery of pines, had the effect to render nights that were obscure darker than common on the lake. As usual, however, a belt of comparative light was etched through the centre of the sheet, while it was within the shadows of the mountains that the gloom rested most heavily on the water. The island or castle stood in this belt of comparative light, but still the night was so dark as to cover the aperture of the Ark. At the distance of an observer on the shore, her movements could not be seen at all, more particularly as a background of dark hillside filled up the perspective of every view that was taken diagonally or directly across the water. The prevailing wind on the lakes of that region is west, but owing to the avenues performed by the mountains it is frequently impossible to tell the true direction of the currents, as they often vary within very short distances and brief differences of time. This is truer in light of fluctuating puffs of air than in steady breezes, though the squalls of even the latter are familiarly known to be uncertain and baffling in all mountainous regions and narrow waters. On the present occasion, Hutter himself, as he shoved the Ark from her berth at the side of the platform, was at a loss to pronounce which way the wind blew. In common, this difficulty was solved by the clouds, which, floating high above the hilltops, as a matter of course, obeyed the currents. But now the whole vault of heaven seemed a massive gloomy wall. Not an opening of any sort was visible, and Chingachgook was already trembling lest the non-appearance of the star might prevent his betrothed from being punctual to her appointment. Under these circumstances, Hutter hoisted his sail, seemingly with the sole intention of getting away from the castle, as it might be dangerous to remain much longer in its vicinity. The air soon filled the cloth, and when the scow was got under command, and the sail was properly trimmed, it was found that the direction was southerly, inclining towards the eastern shore. No better course offering for the purposes of the party, the singular craft was suffered to skim the surface of the water in this direction for more than an hour, when a change in the currents of the air drove them over towards the camp. Deerslayer watched all the movements of Hutter and Harry with jealous attention. At first he did not know whether to ascribe the course they held to accident or to design, but he now began to suspect the latter. Familiar as Hutter was with the lake, it was easy to deceive one who had little practice on the water, and let his intentions be what they might, it was evident, ere 2 hours had elapsed, that the Ark had got sufficient space to be within 100 rods of the shore. directly abreast of the known position of the camp. For a considerable time previously to reaching this point, Hurry, who had some knowledge of the Algonquin language, had been in close conference with the Indian, and the result was now announced by the latter to Deerslayer, who had been a cold, not to say distrusted, looker on of all that passed. "My old father, and my young brother, the Big Pine," for so the Delaware had named March, "want to see Huron scalps at their belts," said Chingachgook to his friend. "There is room for some on the girdle of the Sarpent, and his people will look for them when he goes back to his village. Their eyes must not be left long in a fog, but they must see what they look for. I know that my brother has a white hand. He will not strike even the dead. He will wait for us. When we come back, he will not hide his face from shame for his friend. The Great Serpent of the Mohicans must be worthy to go on the war path with Hawkeye." "Ay, ay, Serpent, I see how it is. That name's to stick, and in time I shall get to be known by it instead of Deerslayer. Well, if such honors will come, the humblest of us all must be willing to abide by 'em. As for your looking for scalps, it belongs to your gifts, and I see no harm in it. Be marciful, Sarpent, howsever, be marciful, I beseech you. It surely can do no harm to a red skin's honor to show a little marcy. As for the old man, the father of 2 young women, who might ripen better feelin's in his heart, and Harry March, here, who, pine as he is, might better bear the fruit of a more Christianized tree, as for them 2, I leave them in the hands of the white man's God. Wasn't it for the bloody sticks, no man should go ag'in the Mingos this night, seeing that it would dishonor our faith and characters. But them that crave blood can't complain if blood is shed at their call. Still, Sarpent, you can be marciful. Don't begin your career with the wails of women and the cries of children. Bear yourself so that Hist will smile, and not weep, when she meets you. Go, then, and the Manitou presarve you. My brother will stay here with the scow. Wah will soon be standing on the shore waiting, and Chingachgook must hasten." The Indian then joined his 2 co-adventurers, and first lowering the sail, they all 3 entered the canoe, and left the side of the Ark. Neither Hutter nor March spoke to Deerslayer concerning their object, or the probable length of their absence. All this had been confided to the Indian, who had acquitted himself of the trust with characteristic brevity. As soon as the canoe was out of sight, and that occurred ere the paddles had given a dozen strokes, Deerslayer made the best dispositions he could to keep the Ark as nearly stationary as possible, and then he sat down in the end of the scow, to chew the cud of his own bitter reflections. It was not long, however, before he was joined by Judith, who sought every occasion to be near him, managing her attack on his affections with the address that was suggested by native coquetry, aided by no little practice, but which received much of its most dangerous power from the touch of feeling that threw around her manner, voice, accents, thoughts, and acts, the indescribable witchery of natural tenderness. Leaving the young hunter exposed to these dangerous assailants, it has become our more immediate business to follow the party in the canoe to the shore. The controlling influence that led Hutter and Hurry to repeat their experiment against the camp was precisely that which had induced the first attempt, a little heightened, perhaps, by the desire of revenge. But neither of these 2 rude beings, so ruthless in all things that touched the rights and interests of the red man, though possessing veins of human feeling on other matters, was much actuated by any other desire than a heartless longing for profit. Hurry had felt angered at his sufferings when first liberated, it is true, but that emotion soon disappeared in the habitual love of gold, which he sought with the reckless avidity of a needy spendthrift, rather than with the ceaseless longings of a miser. In short, the motive that urged them both so soon to go against the Hurons was an habitual contempt of their enemy, acting on the unceasing cupidity of prodigality. The additional chances of success, however, had their place in the formation of the second enterprise. It was known that a large portion of the warriors, perhaps all, were encamped for the night abreast of the castle, and it was hoped that the scalps of helpless victims would be the consequence. To confess the truth, Hutter in particular, he who had just left 2 daughters behind him, expected to find few besides women and children in the camp. The fact had been but slightly alluded to in his communications with Hurry, and with Chingachgook it had been kept entirely out of view. If the Indian thought of it at all, it was known only to himself. Hutter steered the canoe. Hurry had manfully taken his post in the bows, and Chingachgook stood in the centre. We say stood, for all three were so skilled in the management of that species of frail bark, as to be able to keep erect positions in the midst of the darkness. The approach to the shore was made with great caution, and the landing effected in safety. The three now prepared their arms, and began their tiger-like approach upon the camp. The Indian was on the lead, his two companions treading in his footsteps with a stealthy cautiousness of manner that rendered their progress almost literally noiseless. Occasionally a dried twig snapped under the heavy weight of the gigantic Hurry, or the blundering clumsiness of the old man. But, had the Indian walked on air, his step could not have seemed lighter. The great object was first to discover the position of the fire, which was known to be the centre of the whole encampment. At length the keen eye of Chingachgook caught a glimpse of this important guide. It was glimmering at a distance among the trunks of trees. There was no blaze, but merely a single smouldering brand, as suited the hour, the savages usually retiring and rising with the revolutions of the sun. As soon as a view was obtained of this beacon, the progress of the adventurers became swifter and more certain. In a few minutes they got to the edge of the circle of little huts. Here they stopped to survey their ground, and to concert their movements. The darkness was so deep as to render it difficult to distinguish anything but the glowing brand, the trunks of the nearest trees, and the endless canopy of leaves that veiled the clouded heaven. It was ascertained, however, that a hut was quite near, and Chingachgook attempted to reconnoitre its interior. The manner in which the Indian approached the place that was supposed to contain enemies resembled the wily advances of the cat on the bird. As he drew near, he stooped to his hands and knees, for the entrance was so low as to require this attitude, even as a convenience. Before thrusting his head inside, however, he listened long to catch the breathing of sleepers. No sound was audible, and this human serpent thrust his head in at the door, or opening, as another serpent would have peered in on the nest. Nothing rewarded the hazardous experiment, for, after feeling cautiously with a hand, the place was found to be empty. The Delaware proceeded in the same guarded manner to one or two more of the huts, finding all in the same situation. He then returned to his companions, and informed them that the Hurons had deserted their camp. A little further inquiry corroborated this fact, and it only remained to return to the canoe. The different manner in which the adventurers bore the disappointment is worthy of a passing remark. The chief, who had landed solely with the hope of acquiring renown, stood stationary, leaning against a tree, waiting the pleasure of his companions. He was mortified, and a little surprised, it is true, but he bore all with dignity, falling back for support on the sweeter expectations that still lay in reserve for that evening. It was true, he could not now hope to meet his mistress with the proofs of his daring and skill on his person, but he might still hope to meet her, and the warrior, who was zealous in the search, might always hope to be honored. On the other hand, Hutter and Hurry, who had been chiefly instigated by the basest of all human motives, the thirst of gain, could scarce control their feelings. They went prowling among the huts, as if they expected to find some forgotten child, or careless sleeper, and again did they vent their spite on the insensible huts, several of which were actually torn to pieces, and scattered about the place. Nay, they even quarrelled with each other, and fierce reproaches passed between them. It is possible some serious consequences might have occurred, had not the Delaware interfered to remind them of the danger of being so unguarded, and of the necessity of returning to the Ark. This checked the dispute, and in a few minutes they were paddling sullenly back to the spot where they hoped to find that vessel. It has been said that Judith took her place at the side of Deerslayer, soon after the adventurers departed. For a short time the girl was silent, and the hunter was ignorant which of the sisters had approached him, but he soon recognized the rich, full-spirited voice of the elder, as her feelings escaped in words. "This is a terrible life for women, Deerslayer!" she exclaimed. "Would to Heaven I could see an end of it!" "The life is well enough, Judith," was the answer, "being pretty much as it is used or abused. What would you wish to see in its place?" "I should be 1,000 times happier to live nearer to civilized beings. where there are farms and churches, and houses built as it might be by Christian hands, and where my sleep at night would be sweet and tranquil. A dwelling near one of the forts would be far better than this dreary place where we live." "Nay, Judith, I can't agree too lightly in the truth of all this. If forts are good to keep off inimies, they sometimes hold inimies of their own. I don't think 'twould be for your good, or the good of Hetty, to live near one; and if I must say what I think, I'm afeard you are a little too near as it is." Deerslayer went on in his own steady, earnest manner, for the darkness concealed the tints that colored the cheeks of the girl almost to the brightness of crimson, while her own great efforts suppressed the sounds of the breathing that nearly choked her. "As for farms, they have their uses, and there's them that like to pass their lives on 'em. But what comfort can a man look for in a clearin', that he can't find in double quantities in the forest? If air, and room, and light are a little craved, the windrows and the streams will furnish 'em, or here are the lakes for such as have bigger longings in that way. But where are you to find your shades, and laughing springs, and leaping brooks, and venerable trees 1,000 years old, in a clearin'? You don't find them, but you find their disabled trunks, marking the 'arth like headstones in a graveyard. It seems to me that the people who live in such places must be always thinkin' of their own inds, and of universal decay, and that, too, not of the decay that is brought about by time and natur', but the decay that follows waste and violence. Then as to churches, they're good, I suppose, else wouldn't good men uphold 'em, but they are not altogether necessary. They call 'em the temples of the Lord, but, Judith, the whole 'arth is a temple of the Lord to such as have the right mind. Neither forts nor churches make people happier of themselves. Moreover, all is contradiction in the settlements, while all is concord in the woods. Forts and churches almost always go together, and yet they're downright contradictions, churches being for peace, and forts for war. No, no. Give me the strong places of the wilderness, which is the trees, and the churches, too, which are arbors, raised by the hand of nature. Woman is not made for scenes like these, Deerslayer, scenes of which we shall have no end, as long as this war lasts. If you mean women of white color, I rather think you're not far from the truth, gal. But as for the females of the red men, such visitations are quite in character. Nothing would make Hist, now, the bargained wife of yonder Delaware, happier than to know that he is at this moment prowling around his natural inimies, striving after a scalp. Surely, surely, Deerslayer, she cannot be a woman, and not feel concern when she thinks the man she loves is in danger." "She doesn't think of the danger, Judith, but of the honor; and when the heart is desperately set on such feelin's, why, there is little room to crowd in fear. Hist is a kind, gentle, laughing, pleasant creatur', but she loves honor, as well as any Delaware gal I ever know'd. She's to meet the Sarpent an hour hence, on the p'int where Hetty landed, and no doubt she has her anxiety about it, like any other woman, but she'd be all the happier did she know that her lover was at this moment waylaying a Mingo for his scalp." "If you really believe this, Deerslayer, no wonder you lay so much stress on gifts. Certain am I, that no white girl could feel anything but misery while she believed her betrothed in danger of his life. Nor do I suppose even you, unmoved and calm as you ever seem to be, could be at peace if you believed your Hist in danger. That's a different matter. 'Tis altogether a different matter, Judith. Woman is too weak and gentle to be intended to run such risks, and man must feel for her. Yes, I rather think that's as much red natur' as it's white. But I have no Hist, nor am I like to have, for I hold it wrong to mix colors, any way except in friendship and sarvices. In that you are and feel as a white man should. As for Hurry Harry, I do think it would be all the same to him whether his wife were a squaw or a governor's daughter, provided she was a little comely, and could help to keep his craving stomach full. You do March injustice, Judith. Yes, you do. The poor fellow dotes on you, and when a man has ra'ally set his heart on such a creatur', it isn't a Mingo, or even a Delaware gal, that'll be likely to unsettle his mind. You may laugh at such men as Hurry and I, for we're rough and unteached in the ways of books and other knowledge, But we've our good p'ints as well as our bad ones. An honest heart is not to be despised, gal, even though it be not versed in all the niceties that please the female fancy. You, Deerslayer, and do you, can you, for an instant, suppose I place you by the side of Harry March? No, no, I am not so far gone in dullness as that. No one, man or woman, could think of naming your honest heart, manly nature, and simple truth, with the boisterous selfishness, greedy avarice, and overbearing ferocity of Harry March. The very best that can be said of him is to be found in his name of Hurry Skurry, which, if it means no great harm, means no great good. Even my father, following his feelings with the other, as he is doing at this moment, well knows the difference between you. This I know, for he said as much to me in plain language." Judith was a girl of quick sensibilities, and of impetuous feelings, and, being under few of the restraints that curtail the manifestations of maiden emotions among those who are educated in the habits of civilized life, she sometimes betrayed the latter with a feeling that was so purely natural as to place it as far above the wiles of coquetry as it was superior to its heartlessness. She had now even taken one of the hard hands of the hunter and pressed it between both her own, with a warmth and earnestness that proved how sincere was her language. It was perhaps fortunate that she was checked by the very excess of her feelings, since the same power might have urged her on to avow all that her father had said, the old man not having been satisfied with making a comparison favorable to Deerslayer, as between the hunter and Hurry, but having actually, in his blunt, rough way, briefly advised his daughter to cast off the latter entirely, and to think of the former as a husband. Judith would not willingly have said this to any other man, but there was so much confidence awakened by the guileless simplicity of Deerslayer, that one of her nature found it a constant temptation to overstep the bounds of habit. She went no further, however, immediately relinquishing the hand, and falling back on a reserve that was more suited to her sex, and indeed to her natural modesty. "Thankee, Judith, thankee with all my heart," returned the hunter, whose humility prevented him from placing any flattering interpretation on either the conduct or the language of the girl. "Thankee as much as if it was all true. Harry's sightly, yes, he's as sightly as the tallest pine of the mountains, and the Sarpent has named him accordingly. However, some fancy good looks, and some fancy good conduct only. Hurry has one advantage, and it depends on himself whether he'll have t'other, or Hark! That's your father's voice, gal, and he speaks like a man who's riled at something." "God save us from any more of these horrible scenes!" exclaimed Judith, bending her face to her knees, and endeavoring to exclude the discordant sounds by applying her hands to her ears. "I sometimes wish I had no father." This was bitterly said, and the repinings which extorted the words were bitterly felt. It is impossible to say what might next have escaped her had not a gentle, low voice spoken at her elbow. "Judith, I ought to have read a chapter to father and Hurry," said the innocent but terrified speaker, "and that would have kept them from going again on such an errand. Do you call to them, Deerslayer, and tell them I want them, and that it will be good for them both if they'll return and hearken to my words." "Ahs! me! Poor Hetty, you little know the cravins for gold and revenge, if you believe they are so easily turned aside from their longin's. But this is an uncommon business in more ways than one, Judith. I hear your father and Hurry growling like bears, and yet no noise comes from the mouth of the young chief. There's an end of secrecy, and yet his whoop, which ought to ring in the mountains, according to rule in such sarcumstances, is silent. Justice may have alighted on him, and his death have saved the lives of the innocent." "Not it, not it. The Sarpent is not the one to suffer, if that's to be the law. Sartainly there has been no onset, and 'tis most likely that the camp's deserted, and the men are comin' back disapp'inted. That accounts for the growls of Hurry, and the silence of the Sarpent." Just at this instant a fall of a paddle was heard in the canoe. For vexation made March reckless, Deerslayer felt convinced that his conjecture was true. The sail being down, the ark had not drifted far, and ere many minutes he heard Chingachgook, in a low, quiet tone, directing Hutter how to steer in order to reach it. In less time than it takes to tell the fact, the canoe touched the scow, and the adventurers entered the latter. Neither Hutter nor Hurry spoke of what had occurred, but the Delaware, in passing his friend, merely uttered the words "fire's out," which, if not literally true, sufficiently explained the truth to his listener. It was now a question as to the course to be steered. A short surly conference was held, when Hutter decided that the wisest way would be to keep in motion as the means most likely to defeat any attempt at a surprise, announcing his own and March's intention to requite themselves for the loss of sleep during their captivity by lying down. As the air still baffled and continued light, it was finally determined to sail before it, let it come in what direction it might, so long as it did not blow the ark upon the strand. This point settled, the released prisoners helped to hoist the sail, and they threw themselves upon two of the pallets, leaving Deerslayer and his friend to look after the movements of the craft. As neither of the latter was disposed to sleep, on account of the appointment with Hist, this arrangement was acceptable to all parties. That Judith and Hetty remained up also, in no manner impaired the agreeable features of this change. For some time the scow rather drifted than sailed along the western shore, following a light southerly current of the air. The progress was slow, not exceeding a couple of miles in the hour, but the two men perceived that it was not only carrying them towards the point they desired to reach, but at a rate that was quite as fast as the hour yet rendered necessary. But little more was to be said the while, even by the girls, and that little had more reference to the rescue of Hist than to any other subject. The Indian was calm to the eye, but as minute after minute passed, his feelings became more and more excited, until they reached a state that might have satisfied the demands of even the most exacting mistress. Deerslayer kept the craft as much in the bays as was prudent, for the double purpose of sailing within the shadows of the woods, and of detecting any signs of an encampment they might pass on the shore. In this manner they doubled one low point, and were already in the bay that was terminated north by the goal at which they aimed. The latter was still a quarter of a mile distant, when Chingachgook came silently to the side of his friend, and pointed to a place directly ahead. A small fire was glimmering just within the verge of the bushes that lined the shore on the southern side of the point, leaving no doubt that the Indians had suddenly removed their camp to the very place, or at least the very projection of land, where Hist had given them the rendezvous. Chapter 15. Recording by Bill Borst.